I was putting up the last of the apple preserves when my granddaughter called. She was 7 years old and she never called me directly. Her mother had set up the contact in the phone just in case, but in 2 years she had never once used it. So when I saw her name on my screen on that Tuesday afternoon in November, my hands went still. Grandma. Her voice was so small I had to press the phone hard against my ear. Mama didn't pick me up from school. I looked at the clock. It was 4:20. My daughter-in-law, Suzanne, was never late. In 5 years of picking that child up from school, she had not once been late. Not in winter, not during the transit strikes, not even the day she had a tooth pulled and came straight from the dentist's office with cotton wadding still pressed against her jaw. "Where are you right now, sweetheart?" "In the office. With Mrs. Papadopoulos. You stay right there. Don't move. Grandma's coming." I didn't stop to take off my apron. I drove the 40 minutes to the school in 34, and I found my granddaughter sitting in the secretary's office in her coat and backpack, her lunch bag on her lap, her eyes dry in the way that children's eyes go dry when they've been frightened past the point of crying. She looked up when she saw me, and something in her face broke open, and she started to cry then, properly, with her whole body shaking. I held her for a long time. On the drive back, I tried Suzanne's mobile. No answer. I tried my son, Derek. No answer either. He was on a job site up near Sudbury and often lost signal for hours at a stretch. I left him a message telling him not to worry, that his daughter was with me, that I couldn't reach Suzanne and could he call as soon as he got this. I fed my granddaughter supper, scrambled eggs and toast because it was what she asked for, and I wasn't about to argue with her about nutrition on a night like that. I got her settled in front of a video and I stood in my kitchen and I tried Suzanne again. Still nothing. By 7 o'clock, I had a feeling in my chest that I hadn't felt since the night Derek's father had his first cardiac event. That cold, still weight that sits just below your sternum and tells you quietly and without any drama that something is genuinely wrong. I called the non-emergency police line. I explained that my daughter-in-law had not picked up her daughter from school, had not answered her phone in 3 hours, and that this was completely unlike her. The woman on the line was patient. She took down Suzanne's description, the make and color of her car, a silver Honda Civic 2019, and she told me someone would follow up. Derek finally called at 8:15. I told him everything. There was a silence on the line that I recognized. It was the same silence his father used to make when he was trying to stay calm for my sake. "I'm coming home," he said. "The roads are icy tonight. Be careful." "Mom, I'm coming home." He arrived just before midnight. By then, my granddaughter was asleep in the guest room and I was sitting at the kitchen table with the cup of tea gone cold in front of me. He came in, still in his work clothes, and he looked 10 years older than when I'd last seen him 2 weeks before. We sat together and we waited. The call came at 12:47 in the morning. It was a constable from the OPP. They had found Suzanne's car on a logging road off Highway 69, about 60 kilometers north of Parry Sound. Suzanne was alive. She was being airlifted to Sunnybrook in Toronto. Derek was already putting his coat back on before the constable had finished speaking. I stayed with my granddaughter. I sat in the armchair beside her bed and I watched her breathe, and I thought about Suzanne, who had come into our family 8 years ago as a quiet, careful woman who brought homemade butter tarts to every family gathering and learned to make my mother's cabbage rolls from the recipe card I gave her, and who had loved my son, I believe, better than he sometimes deserved to be loved. At 4 in the morning, Derek called me from the hospital. "She's stable," he said. "Mom, he stopped. I heard him breathe. Someone beat her and left her. The car was driven off the road and left in the trees, and she was just left there, Mom, in November, on a logging road." I didn't say anything for a moment. "How bad?" I asked. "Broken wrist, 3 cracked ribs, hypothermia. She was out there for at least 5 hours. Another pause. Another pause. The doctor said if the temperature had dropped another 2 degrees, she probably wouldn't have made it through. I thought about my granddaughter asleep down the hall. I thought about how she had never in her life used that contact in her phone until that afternoon. "Derek?" I said. Do they know who did this? He was quiet for a long time. The police are talking to her now, he said. She's conscious enough. She told them she knew who it was. He didn't tell me more than that on the phone. I didn't push. But something in his voice, the way he had gone careful and flat, the way people go when they're managing information they think will hurt you, told me that whatever Suzanne had said to the police was something that would change things. I found out 4 days later when Suzanne was moved out of the ICU and into a regular room, and I was finally allowed to see her. She looked small in the hospital bed. Suzanne was not a small woman. She was tall and broad-shouldered, a woman who had grown up on a farm outside of Guelph and who could lift things that surprised people. But in that bed, with the bruising still vivid across her cheekbone and her wrist in a cast, and the shadows under her eyes, she looked like someone had taken something essential out of her. I sat down beside her and I took her good hand, and I didn't say anything right away. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is just be quiet. After a while, she turned her head and looked at me. I need to tell you something, she said. You don't have to tell me anything today. I do. She took a careful breath, carefully because of the ribs. It was Sandra. I heard the name and I sat with it for a moment. Sandra was my son's sister-in-law, not mine. I had no connection to her by blood or affection. She was married to Derek's older brother, Clifford, and she had made her feelings about Suzanne known from the moment Suzanne first came to a family dinner 8 years ago. Small things at first. Comments about Suzanne's clothes, her job, the neighborhood she'd grown up in. Then larger things, delivered with the particular precision that some people have for cruelty dressed up as concern. Suzanne had never complained. That was her way. She absorbed things and said nothing and smiled carefully and drove home and cried. I suspected when no one was watching. I had seen it. I had said to Clifford once, privately, that his wife needed to reconsider how she spoke to Suzanne. Clifford had told me I was being sensitive. After that, I had kept my distance from Sandra as much as family life allowed. But this? Sandra did this to you, I said. Not a question. She called me that morning. She said she needed to speak with me privately, somewhere the family wouldn't hear. She said it was about Derek, about something she'd found out about him that I needed to know. Suzanne's jaw tightened. I should have. Don't, I said. Don't do that. She looked at me. Don't explain why you trusted her, I said. She told you it was about your husband. Of course you went. That's not a failure of judgment, Suzanne. That's what she was counting on. She was quiet for a moment. Then she continued. She had driven to the address Sandra gave her, which turned out to be a property up past Parry Sound, a piece of land that Clifford had been trying to develop for 2 years, a property that had been tied up in some kind of dispute and that, as far as Suzanne knew, was still sitting empty. She had parked and gotten out of her car, and Sandra had been waiting for her on the logging road. There had been a man with her. Suzanne didn't know him. She told me what had happened after that in a voice so steady that it frightened me more than tears would have. When it was over, Sandra had crouched down beside her on the ground and said, in a very quiet voice, that Suzanne needed to understand her place, that she had never been good enough for this family, that whatever she thought she had built here could be taken apart. Then they had driven her car off the edge of the logging road and walked away. I held Suzanne's hand and I looked at the window, at the gray November sky over the city, and I thought about my son's sister-in-law crouching down beside an injured woman on a frozen road and saying those things. I have lived 63 years. I have tried in that time to be a fair person, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to believe that most cruelty comes from fear or pain and not from something settled and intentional. I revised that belief, sitting in that hospital room. When I left, I drove not back to my house, but to the offices of my friend Rosalind, who had retired from family law practice 2 years earlier, but who still had an office she used for consulting and who had known me for 31 years. I sat across from her desk and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons I had always trusted her. All right, she said when I finished. The criminal piece is straightforward. Assault causing bodily harm at minimum, potentially aggravated assault, possibly forcible confinement depending on how the Crown wants to characterize it. Suzanne needs to give a full recorded statement while her memory is fresh, and if there's a witness or any physical evidence on that property, there's the man who was with Sandra. That's potentially conspiracy? That's serious. She folded her hands. What about the other piece? I had not mentioned a second piece. But Rosalind had known me for 31 years. The property, I said. The logging road was on Clifford's development land, which means Clifford either knew or didn't know. Yes, and if he knew, then he let his wife arrange this on property he owns and controls. We looked at each other. There's something else, I said. Derek's father, my late husband Gordon, he had a parcel of land near Collingwood. When he died, he left it jointly to Derek and Clifford to be managed together until they agreed on what to do with it. That was 4 years ago. In the last 6 months, Clifford has been pushing Derek to sign off on a sale. Derek has been hesitant because the offer seemed low and he wanted to get an independent assessment. Rosalind was still watching me. 2 weeks ago, Clifford told Derek that the buyer was pulling out, that the deal had fallen through and they had missed their window. I paused. I've been going through Gordon's paper since this happened. I found correspondence, emails Clifford forwarded to Derek about the sale, about the buyer. But when I looked up the numbered company that was supposedly the buyer, I found a directorship listing. One of the directors is a numbered holding company registered in Ontario, and when I traced that holding company through the provincial registry, let me guess, Rosalind said quietly, Sandra's maiden name is on the original incorporation documents. The room was very quiet. Clifford was selling the land to a company his wife controls, I said, and telling Derek the deal fell through. Rosalind uncapped her pen. You better start from the beginning, she said. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple. Nothing like this ever is. There were police interviews and Suzanne's formal statement and a bail hearing for Sandra that I did not attend, but that Derek described to me afterward in a voice that still had shock in it, even after everything. There were conversations with lawyers, with a forensic accountant that Rosalind recommended, with the Ontario Securities Commission's tip line regarding the property transaction. There was also Christmas, which we had quietly at my house. Just Derek and Suzanne, her wrist still in a cast. The bruising finally faded, and my granddaughter, who had been told only that her Aunt Sandra had done something very wrong and was in trouble with the police. My granddaughter had nodded with the matter-of-fact gravity of a 7-year-old who understands more than adults give her credit for, and then asked if we could make shortbread. We made shortbread. In January, Clifford came to see me. He came alone, which surprised me. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table I had sat at through 30 years of family gatherings, the same table where Gordon had read his newspaper every Sunday morning for 26 years. And he looked at his hands. I didn't know she was going to do that, he said. I want you to be clear that I did not know she was going to hurt Suzanne. All right, I said. I mean it. I heard you, Clifford. He looked up. His face was tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He was 58 years old and he looked, sitting there suddenly and completely his age. The property, he said. Yes, I thought. He stopped. I convinced myself it wasn't actually wrong because the price was fair market, that Sandra would just hold it, and eventually we buy it back or develop it together. And Derek would never know you'd sold Gordon's land to your own wife. He didn't answer. Gordon left that land to both of you, I said. I kept my voice even. I had practiced keeping my voice even. He trusted you both. He trusted you specifically, Clifford, because you were the eldest and because he believed you would look after your brother. I know. Your wife left Suzanne on a frozen logging road in November. I know. His voice cracked on the second word. I know what she did, and your land made it easy for her to do it in a place she knew would be empty, a place with no cameras, no traffic, no witnesses. He didn't try to argue with that. The criminal charges against Sandra proceeded through the spring, aggravated assault. The man who had been with her, a former colleague of Clifford's, a piece of information that caused another long and difficult conversation, was charged as well. Sandra's lawyer entered negotiations. There was a plea. It was not the outcome I would have written if I were writing it, but Rosalind explained to me, carefully and without false comfort, that trials are not stories and that outcomes are never guaranteed, and that what Sandra agreed to would follow her for the rest of her life, regardless of what I felt about the number of months. Suzanne thanked me in May on the back porch of her house while my granddaughter was inside doing her homework. It was a warm evening for May. That particular soft warmth that comes to Ontario in the weeks before the black flies arrive and makes you forget that the winter was ever as long as it was. "You didn't have to do the property piece," Suzanne said. "The police case was already there. You could have just let that be enough." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you?" I thought about Gordon's papers spread across my kitchen table. I thought about the numbered company and the corporate registry and Rosalind uncapping her pen. I thought about Sandra crouching on the frozen road and telling Suzanne she needed to understand her place. "Because Gordon worked 40 years for that land," I said. "He was a careful man. He saved carefully and planned carefully, and he believed, when he left it to his sons, that they would honor that it would stand for something." I looked at the maple tree in Suzanne's backyard, which was fully leafed out now and moving slightly in the evening wind. I wasn't going to let it be used to hide what happened to you. Suzanne didn't say anything for a moment. "He would have liked you," she said finally. "Gordon, he loved you," I said. "He told me once that Derek had made a very wise decision. Gordon didn't hand out compliments casually." She laughed, a real laugh, the kind she hadn't had in a while. It was good to hear. The property matter was resolved through the courts by summer. The transaction was set aside. The land near Collingwood reverted jointly to Derek and Clifford pending further legal proceedings regarding the breach of the fiduciary duty. Clifford did not fight this. Whether from guilt or calculation or some mixture of both, I cannot say. He and Derek have not spoken since January. I don't know if they ever will. Some things, once broken, don't reassemble into the same shape, and perhaps that is not always a loss. Sandra moved out of their house in June. I don't know where she went. I found I didn't need to know. What I know is this. On a Tuesday evening in November, my granddaughter used a phone contact she had never used before, and that small, frightened voice on the line, "Grandma, Mama didn't pick me up from school," was the thing that set everything in motion. Not the courts, not the forensic accountant, not the corporate registry. That child, sitting in a school office with her lunch bag on her lap, trusting that someone would come. I drove 40 minutes in 34 and I found her there and I brought her home. It seems like such a small thing when I write it down, but I have come to believe that the small things are where it begins. The small things and the people who show up when they're needed. The shortbread, by the way, was excellent. My granddaughter has my mother's instinct for when the butter is properly room temperature. I told her so, and she considered this very seriously and said she already knew. I believed her. I've been thinking, since all of this settled, about what it actually takes for things to go as wrong as they went with Sandra. It doesn't happen overnight. That's the part people don't want to sit with. It happens in layers. A comment here, a slight there, a pattern of small cruelties that everyone around the table quietly agrees not to name because naming it would make the dinner uncomfortable. I was part of that, in my own way. I saw what Sandra was doing to Suzanne over 8 years, and I said something once, and when Clifford brushed it off, I let it go. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself Suzanne was managing. She was managing. She was absorbing it alone, the way people do when they've learned that speaking up costs more than staying quiet. That's not a character flaw. That's what happens when a person has been taught, slowly and consistently, that their discomfort doesn't register. What I understand now, sitting on the other side of it, is that silence has a cost too, not the dramatic cost of a logging road in November. Nothing so stark as that. A quieter cost. The slow accumulation of what goes unsaid becomes the permission structure for what comes next. Sandra did what she did because, for 8 years, nothing she had done before it had carried a real consequence. The family absorbed it. I absorbed it. And she learned from that. I'm not saying I caused what happened. I want to be clear about that. Sandra made her own choices and she will carry them. But I think about what I might have done differently with the information I had. The discomfort of one difficult conversation, held clearly and without apology, against what Suzanne went through on that road. It is not a comfortable comparison. What I believe, after 63 years, is that decency is not a feeling. It's a practice. It requires doing the thing that is harder in the short term because you understand, in some part of yourself, that the easier path leads somewhere you don't want to end up. Clifford understood this and chose the easier path anyway. That is the difference between knowing what is right and having the steadiness to do it when it costs you something. My granddaughter called me because she had been taught, without being explicitly taught, that I would come. Derek and Suzanne had built that into her without making a lesson of it. That's what integrity looks like when it's working. Not a declaration, just a quiet reliability that a 7-year-old absorbs and trusts without having words for it yet. Gordon built that too, in his way. 40 years of careful work, careful saving, careful planning. Not because he expected a reward, but because he believed that how you handle what's yours reflects what you actually think about the people who will come after you. He left that land to his sons in good faith. Honoring that faith, when it had been violated, felt less like revenge and more like finishing a sentence he had started. The shortbread was excellent. My granddaughter already knows when the butter is right. Some things pass forward on their own. He was sitting on the front steps of my house when I pulled into the driveway, not standing, sitting, with his jacket still on and his hands hanging between his knees, the way he used to sit when he was 14 and something had gone wrong at school. Except he was 41 years old, and beside him on the step was a hockey bag and a green garbage bag tied at the top, and my 5-year-old grandson was asleep against his shoulder with one arm dangling loose. I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment. Then I got out of the car. "Get inside," I said, "both of you." He looked up at me and I could see he'd been crying or close to it. He said, "Mom, she changed the locks." "I heard you on the phone," I said. "Get inside." I picked up the garbage bag he carried his son. I should tell you who I am because it matters for what happened next. My name is Frances. I'm 64 years old. I live in Canada, just west of Ottawa, in the house I've owned for 31 years. I retired 18 months ago from a 30-year career as a paralegal, the last 19 of those years with a firm that specialized in residential real estate and tenancy law. I am not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. But I know the Residential Tenancies Act the way some people know their own handwriting. I know it because I had to. Because when you spend 2 decades preparing documents, reviewing leases, sitting across from people who had just been told they had 72 hours to leave a home they'd lived in for years, you learn it. You learn every word of it. My daughter-in-law did not know that about me. I'm not sure my son had ever thought to mention it. That's fine. People tell you who they are sooner or later. My son. I'll call him by his middle name here, the way I always do when I'm telling a story about him. Kit. Kit had been with his wife for 9 years, married for 6. They had one child together, my grandson Ollie, who was 5 in March. They had bought a house in Barhaven 3 years ago. The house was purchased jointly. I know because I helped Kit understand the mortgage documents before he signed them. I remember sitting at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, going through each page, flagging things with sticky notes. His wife wasn't there that day. She'd gone to her mother's. Kit asked me once if I thought they were rushing it. I told him I couldn't answer that. I told him to make sure his name was on everything. He thanked me. He signed. Both names went on the title. That matters. He told me the story in pieces, the way people do when they're embarrassed and exhausted at the same time. It came out over 2 hours while Ollie slept on my couch under the quilt I'd had since the kids were small, and I made tea and then didn't drink it, and Kit sat at my kitchen table and talked. He and his wife had been struggling for about a year, not fighting exactly, drifting. He said it felt like living with someone who had already made a decision but hadn't told him yet. He'd suggested counseling twice. She'd agreed once and then canceled after the first session because of work. He'd tried not to push. In October, she told him she wanted to separate. He said he understood. He told her he wanted to do it properly, calmly, the way people are supposed to when a child is involved. He asked only that they figure out the house situation and Ollie's schedule before either of them did anything drastic. She said yes. She said she would talk to a lawyer. What he didn't know, and what I think had been going on for some time, was that her mother had moved into the picture. Her mother. I had met her maybe a dozen times over the years. She was not a warm woman. She had opinions about things that were none of her business and expressed them freely. She'd made a comment at Ollie's 4th birthday about how Kit didn't seem like the provider type. I had smiled and said nothing. Kit had pretended not to hear. When her daughter told her the marriage was ending, she apparently took it as an invitation to involve herself completely. Kit came home on a Tuesday evening in November after picking up Ollie from daycare and found the locks changed. His key didn't work. The back door didn't work. His wife wasn't answering her phone. Her mother's car was in the driveway. He stood on his own front step for 20 minutes holding his son's hand before he called me. I want to be careful here because I know how these stories can go. I know people read things like this and they want to see red, and I understand why. A 5-year-old child standing in the cold in front of his own house, his father unable to open the door, his grandmother's car parked right there. But here's what I've learned. After 30 years of watching disputes unfold on paper, and then in courtrooms, and then in parking lots, and then back to paper again, panic is not useful. Panic makes you reactive, and when you're reactive, you make mistakes. And when you make mistakes, the other side wins. I felt anger. I won't pretend I didn't. When Kit showed up on my step with that garbage bag, when I looked at my grandson's face slack with exhausted sleep, something cold and very clear settled in behind my ribs. Not rage, clarity. I knew exactly what had been done, and I knew exactly what could be done about it. I put Kit to bed in the guest room with Ollie at 9:30. Then I went to my office. I still have one, even retired because old habits, and I sat down and started making a list. The first thing you need to understand about what happened to Kit is that it was illegal. Under Ontario's Residential Tenancies Act, and more broadly under property law, a co-owner of a jointly titled home cannot be locked out of that property by another co-owner or by a third party acting on their behalf. Kit's name was on the title. It had been on the title for 3 years. He had every legal right to be in that house, to access that house, to occupy that house. What his wife had done, or allowed to be done, was not a separation maneuver. It was an unlawful exclusion. Changing the locks on a co-owner is not a gray area. It doesn't matter who paid what, who packed whose things, or what the mother-in-law thought she was accomplishing. You cannot lock a co-owner out of jointly held property. Full stop. The second thing you need to understand is that they had done this with a child involved, without any court order, without any custody arrangement in place, without any legal authority whatsoever. Ollie had been taken from his routine, his home, his room, not by agreement, by a lock change. I wrote down 3 names: my former employer, a family lawyer I'd worked alongside for 11 years who'd since moved to a smaller firm, and the legal aid number for emergency property situations that I had memorized because I'd given it out so many times over the years. Then I went to bed, because the morning would require me to be sharp. Kit was up before me. I found him at the kitchen table at 6:15 with a cup of coffee and the look of someone who had slept 2 hours out of pure exhaustion and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling. Ollie was still asleep. "What do we do?" he said. I sat down across from him. "You're gonna call in late to work," I said. "Then we're gonna talk." I asked him to walk me through the paperwork. Did he have copies of the mortgage documents, the title, the original purchase agreement? He had the mortgage documents in his car. He'd grabbed a folder of papers on his way out, before the lock change, some instinct he couldn't explain. He did not have the title, but I told him I could access land registry records online. He had the original purchase agreement on his email, buried under 2 years of other messages. But there, I asked him about finances. Had he been contributing to the mortgage? Yes, every month, from a joint account, and when the joint account ran short 1 month last winter, he transferred directly from his personal account and had the bank records to prove it. I asked him about his mother-in-law. Had money ever changed hands between her and Kit and his wife? Had she contributed to the house purchase, any renovation, anything? He thought about it. He said her mother had given them $10,000 when they first bought the house. He said it was described as a gift, not a loan. He said there was a card. He still had the card. I told him to find it. I told him that what I was about to say was not legal advice, that I was a retired paralegal and not a lawyer, and that anything I helped him understand today should be followed up with an actual lawyer. He nodded. He had that look I remembered from when he was a teenager, when things were finally making sense. The lock change was illegal, I said. Full stop. You are untitled. You have the right to be in that house. They cannot exclude you without a court order, and there is no court order because no one has filed anything. Right now, you have every legal right to walk back into that house. He looked at me. You could call a locksmith, I said, re-enter your own home, and there is nothing unlawful about that. But we're not going to do that today because we're going to do this in a way that protects you long-term, not just gets you through the front door. I watched him breathe. Ollie, he said. Ollie is with you, I said. He came with you. No one has made any custody application. Right now, you have your son. The law does not look kindly on people who use a child as leverage in a separation, especially when they've done something as flagrant as locking a co-owner out of a jointly titled property. Kit put his face in his hands, not crying, just taking it in. I called my former colleague at 9:15 that morning. She'd known Kit since he was in university. He'd come to the office once or twice when he was young, done a summer errand job for us the year he was 19. She remembered him. I explained the situation concisely. She asked 2 questions. Is his name on title, and does he have documentation of financial contributions? I said yes to both. She said she could see him at 2 o'clock. I drove him there myself. Ollie stayed with me at my house, eating crackers and watching something on the tablet Kit had managed to grab in his armload of belongings on the way out the day before. My daughter-in-law had not called. Her mother had not called. Her mother had not called. No one had called. That silence told me something. The meeting went 2 hours. By the end of it, Kit had a clear picture of where he stood. His lawyer, and I will say that watching him shake her hand and start down a path with actual legal representation was one of the better things I've witnessed in recent years, explained that the lock change constituted unlawful exclusion and could be grounds for a court order requiring immediate re-entry. She also explained the circumstances around Ollie, the lack of any parenting agreement, the child being present during the lock change, the fact that Kit had voluntarily taken his son with him rather than leaving him in a volatile situation. All of this was relevant to any subsequent custody discussion. She also noted something I had thought about but not raised with Kit directly, that if his mother-in-law had been involved in planning or facilitating the lock change, and if she had any claim or thought she had a claim on the property, that would need to be addressed separately. The gift of $10,000, documented as a gift, was a gift. It did not purchase her an interest in the property, but people sometimes forget that, or pretend to forget. Kit signed a retainer that afternoon. 4 days later, a letter was sent. I am not going to reproduce the contents of a legal letter in detail here, because that's not the point of this story. But I will tell you what it addressed. The unlawful exclusion. Kit's right as a co-owner to access and occupy the property. The requirement that access be restored within a specified period or further legal steps would follow. The current custody situation and the expectation that any parenting arrangement be established formally without unilateral action from either party or any third party. And a specific note regarding the involvement of his mother-in-law in the events of that Tuesday, and that any further action by non-title holding parties with respect to the property would be treated accordingly. My daughter-in-law called Kit the morning after the letter arrived. He told me about it later, almost word for word, because he knew I'd want to know. She said she hadn't realized how serious it was. She said her mother had told her it was just a separation thing and that changing the locks was normal. She said she was sorry about Ollie. She said things had gotten out of hand. Kit was quiet on the phone. He told me later he didn't feel like yelling. He said he just felt tired. He said he told her that they could figure things out properly, the way he'd always wanted to, but that it needed to happen through their lawyers from that point on. He said he told her that he wasn't interested in a fight, that he just wanted things to be fair. She agreed. Her mother did not call. I want to say something about her mother because I think about her sometimes. Not with anger, exactly, more with a kind of tired recognition. She thought she was helping. I believe that. I think she saw her daughter in pain and decided the best thing she could do was act decisively, be the muscle, be the plan, be the solution. She walked into that house on a Tuesday morning and she had a locksmith there by noon, and she probably felt for a few hours that she had handled things. What she didn't count on was that the person she was locking out had a mother who'd spent 30 years in tenancy and property law. What she didn't count on was that families contain more than you know, and that you should be careful about who you're dealing with before you start making moves. I don't think she's a monster. I think she's someone who acted without understanding the ground she was standing on. That happens. It happens all the time. But it has consequences. Kit moved back into the house the following week, not because the situation was resolved, not because the separation was over. It wasn't, and there were months ahead that were genuinely hard, but because he had every right to be there, and that right had been formally established. He and his wife worked out a parenting schedule with their respective lawyers. It took time. There were moments when it got contentious. But Ollie had two parents who kept showing up for him, and that's the part that mattered most. The house was eventually listed for sale, the proceeds split according to title. The $10,000 was not a factor because it was a gift, and it was documented as a gift, and when you document things, it stays that way. Kit has his own apartment now in Nepean. It's small, but it's his. Ollie spends every other week there, and they've made it cozy. There's a hockey poster on the wall and a jar of goldfish crackers in the cupboard because Ollie has a phase where that's all he wants for a snack. And Kit says he's bought more goldfish crackers in the past year than he bought food of any kind in his 20s. He's okay. He's more than okay. I tell this story because of what I've seen over the years, because I've sat across from people in offices and community centers and, once, a Tim Hortons at 7 in the morning, and I've watched people feel powerless about things that they did not have to be powerless about. They didn't know their rights. They thought whoever made the first move had won. They thought that if someone changed the locks stayed changed. That is not how the law works. If you're on title, you are on title. If you have contributed to a property, document it. If someone excludes you from a jointly held home without a court order, that exclusion is not legal. And if someone is using a child as a bargaining chip in a dispute, that matters to the courts more than any loud gesture or any mother-in-law with the locksmith's number. I know it feels impossible when you're standing on your own front step at 5 o'clock in November, holding your kid's hand in the cold. I know it feels like whoever locked the door holds all the power. They don't. You do not have to figure it out alone. You do not have to accept the first reality someone hands you. There are people who know how this works. Find them. Call them. Walk in the door you have every legal right to walk through. Kit asked me once, a few months after everything settled, if I'd been scared for him. I told him the truth. I said no, not scared. I saw exactly what had happened, and I knew exactly what could be done. What I felt, standing in my driveway looking at him on those steps, was not fear. It was certainty. And certainty, when you know what you're dealing with it, is a very powerful thing to have. I've thought about that Tuesday evening more times than I can count. Kit on my front steps, Ollie asleep against his shoulder, 2 garbage bags on the concrete like some kind of verdict had already been handed down. What strikes me now isn't the anger I felt, though it was there, steady and cold underneath everything else. What strikes me is how much that moment depended on things that had happened years before it. Every choice has a shape, and that shape casts a shadow forward. His mother-in-law made a decision that Tuesday morning. She called a locksmith and she changed the locks on a home her son-in-law had every legal right to enter, and she did it because she believed that whoever acts first wins. That belief cost her. Not because the universe punished her for being unkind. I don't think the world works quite that neatly, but because she made a move without understanding the ground beneath her feet, and the ground gave way. That's the thing about acting without integrity. Not the abstract, sermon on a Sunday kind of integrity. The practical, daily kind. The kind where you ask yourself whether what you're doing is actually fair before you do it, not after you've been caught. She bypassed that question entirely. She saw her daughter hurting and she went straight to leverage. And leverage only works when the other side has less information than you do. I had 30 years of information. Kit, for his part, had done something I was proud of without fully realizing it. In those first hours, when he could have done any number of reactive things, shown up at the door and made a scene, posted something online, called her names in front of Ollie, he didn't. He sat on my steps, and he waited. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was the kind of steadiness that comes from a person who, somewhere along the way, decided to be decent even when decency costs something. That quality is quiet. It doesn't make a lot of noise. But it matters enormously when things go sideways, because it means you walk into a lawyer's office with clean hands and a clear account of what happened. And then there's the third part, the part that people don't talk about enough, the part where you actually do something, where you don't just feel righteous, you act. Kit could have absorbed the situation and decided it was too complicated, too expensive, too exhausting. Separations are hard. Lawyers cost money. It would have been easier in the short run to let it go. A lot of people do. They absorb the wrong done to them because fighting back feels impossible, and the people who counted on that passivity walk away thinking they've won something permanent. They haven't. They've only won the first few hours. What I've learned, really learned, not just as a professional principle, but as something I believe in my bones, is that knowing your rights and being willing to act on them is one of the most important things a person can do for themselves and for the people they love. It's not aggression. It isn't about winning or humiliating anyone. It's about understanding clearly what is true and then standing in that truth without flinching. Kit has his apartment now. Ollie has his 2 homes, his hockey poster, his jar of goldfish crackers, and I have the memory of that morning, sitting across from my son at my kitchen table, watching something settle in his face as the fog lifted and the path forward became visible. That's enough for me. I noticed something the morning Vivienne arrived for Sunday dinner with my son. It was the way she touched the door frame, slow, deliberate, like she was measuring it. I told myself I was imagining things. I've been wrong before. I'm 63 years old, and I've learned that being wrong is sometimes the kindest thing that can happen to you. My name is Lorraine. I live in a house in Fredericton, New Brunswick that my late husband Gordon and I bought in 1989 for $212,000. Gordon passed 6 years ago, heart attack April, the kind of spring morning that makes the cruelty of it worse somehow. He was 61. We had plans. We had a trip booked to Newfoundland. We had a retirement that was supposed to look a certain way. Instead, I had a house, a grief counselor named Susan who smelled like lavender, a son named Theo, and a daughter-in-law I hadn't met yet. The house is worth more now, a lot more. The neighborhood changed around us while we weren't paying attention. Young professionals, renovated Victorians, coffee shops where the dry cleaner used to be. 3 years ago, a real estate agent knocked on my door unsolicited and told me she had buyers who would pay $940,000, cash, no conditions. I politely told her I wasn't interested and closed the door. Gordon had bought this house for us. The floors creak in the same spots they always did. The kitchen window still sticks in July. I am not selling. Besides the house, I have an investment portfolio. Gordon was meticulous about that. God bless him. The teacher's pension, some savings bonds. In total, comfortable. More than comfortable. I never talk about the numbers because my mother raised me to believe that talking about money was common, and I have not yet found a reason to disagree with her. Theo is my only child. He's 34, works in project management for a construction firm in Fredericton, and has his father's habit of going quiet when something bothers him rather than saying so. I love him more than I can explain without embarrassing both of us. He met Vivian at a work event in Moncton. She was there representing an architectural firm, he said. Smart, driven, he said. Beautiful, he said, in the way men say it when they mean something more than pretty. The first time I met her was at a lunch Theo arranged at Zen Garden on Regent Street. She was charming, sharp sense of humor, asked me good questions about my years as a nurse, seemed genuinely interested. She had a directness I respected. When she hugged me goodbye, she squeezed my hand and said, "I'm so glad Theo has you." I liked her. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I liked her. I am not a woman who starts with suspicion. I start with welcome. The first question came about 3 weeks later. Theo had brought Vivian to the house for dinner, roast chicken, Gordon's mother's recipe, and afterward we sat with tea in the living room. Vivian looked around in a way that felt appreciative. She commented on the crown molding, the original hardwood, the bay window. "You must have done significant renovations over the years," she said. "Some," I said. "New kitchen in 2008, roof in 2015, and you own outright? No mortgage?" I paused for just a moment. "Gordon paid it off before he retired," I said. She nodded, smiled, moved on. Theo hadn't seemed to notice anything. I thought, she's an architect. Property is just how she thinks. An occupational habit? I let it go. The second question came 2 months later, on a different evening, after a very good bottle of Riesling that Vivienne had brought. We were talking about the neighborhood, about how it had changed, and she asked, very naturally, as though it had simply occurred to her, whether I had considered downsizing. At some point, I said, "Not now." "Of course," she said. "It's just a house this size alone. It must be a lot to manage." "I manage," I said. "Theo said Mom loves this house, Viv." She smiled and said she understood completely. Third question, 6 weeks after that. We had walked along the riverfront, her suggestion, and somewhere near Carlton Street, she asked whether I had a financial advisor. I said I did. A woman named Frances at TD who had managed our accounts for 15 years and who I trusted completely. Vivienne said, "It's just, the market has been complicated lately. Theo and I have been using someone different. He's been incredible for us." I said I was happy with Frances. She said, "Of course. Just wanted to mention it." I went home that evening and stood in Gordon's kitchen and thought about the door frame, the way she'd touched it the first night. I was not imagining things. I want to tell you what kind of woman I am at 63. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse, the last 12 in palliative care at the Dr. Everett Chalmers Regional Hospital. I have sat with dying people and held their hands and watched their families navigate grief and greed and guilt all at once. I know what a person looks like when they are cataloging an asset. I know what it looks like when someone is being kind for reasons. I didn't say anything to Theo, not yet. He was happy. The way your child is happy when they have found the person they want, unguarded, lighter than usual, teasing me about my crossword puzzles and staying for dinner more often. I was not going to walk into that with suspicion I couldn't yet prove. What I did was call Frances. "I want to review everything," I said. "The portfolio, the beneficiary designations, the RARIF drawdown schedule. And I want to add a note to my file that no one, not a family member, not a financial advisor someone else recommends, no one is to be added to any account without my written authorization and a 48-hour waiting period." Frances didn't ask why. She's a good advisor. She just said, "I'll have everything ready Thursday." Then I called my lawyer, a man named Bernard who had handled Gordon's estate and who I trusted as much as I trust anyone. I asked him to review my will, my powers of attorney, and specifically my healthcare directive. I told him I wanted to discuss what it would take for someone to legally challenge my capacity or have themselves appointed as my decision maker. Bernard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Lorraine, is there something specific prompting this?" I said, "I want to understand my vulnerabilities before someone else does." He said he'd see me Friday. What I learned from Bernard changed things. In New Brunswick, as in most of Canada, a person can apply to the court to be appointed as the committee, the legal guardian, of another person if they can demonstrate that person lacks capacity to manage their own affairs. Medical testimony plays a central role. A single physician's opinion can initiate the process. It is not common, but it happens, and it happens most often to elderly people with significant assets who have no close family watching carefully. I thought about Vivienne asking about my financial advisor. I thought about the question, so gentle, so casual, about whether I ever found the house too much to manage alone. I thought about what managing alone might eventually look like in a doctor's report. I made an appointment with my own GP, Dr. Hendricks, and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. She's been my doctor for 20 years and she knows how I speak. When I finished, she said, "I want this documented in your file. And I want you to know that if anyone contacts this office asking about your cognitive status or requesting any kind of referral for capacity assessment, I will notify you immediately." She also said something that stayed with me. She said, "Lorraine, trust what you know." I did. It was Theo's birthday in October. He turned 34, and we had dinner at my house. Just the three of us, with the chocolate torte he'd loved since childhood. After dinner, Vivienne offered to help me with the dishes, and Theo went to watch the game in the living room. We were standing at the sink when she said very quietly, "Theo worries about you, you know. Being here alone." "Does he?" I said. "He doesn't say it to you because he doesn't want to upset you. But he wonders, what happens if something happens? What if you need help quickly and there's no one here?" I kept washing the dish in my hand. "I've spoken to my lawyer," I said, "and my doctor. My affairs are all in order." Something shifted in her face. I caught it before she could settle it back. A small recalibration, like something had been added up differently. "That's so smart," she said. "You're always so organized." When they left, I sat down at Gordon's kitchen table and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. I called my friend Audrey, who has known me since nursing school and who once talked me out of a very bad haircut and has never steered me wrong. I told her everything. She listened and then said, "What does your gut say?" "That this isn't random," I said. "That she's been mapping me." "Then what are you going to do?" "I'm going to find out who she is," I said. Audrey said, "I know someone." Audrey's someone turned out to be a private investigator named Claude who operated out of St. John. He was quiet, professional, and thorough. I paid him his retainer in a bank draft. Gordon had taught me never to leave a financial trail you hadn't chosen yourself. Claude came back to me 3 weeks later with a file. I sat at my kitchen table and opened it with coffee and the particular steadiness you develop after 3 decades of palliative nursing, the ability to receive difficult information without flinching. Vivienne's full name was Vivienne Hargrove. Before Moncton, she had lived in Calgary, then Halifax. In Calgary, she had been engaged, briefly, to a man in his late 60s named Robert who owned commercial real estate. The engagement had ended abruptly. Robert's adult daughter had been the one to end it. Claude had spoken to the daughter, who told him that Vivienne had spent 8 months asking Robert to add her to his investment accounts, had referred him to a different financial advisor, and had, the daughter's word, worked very hard to limit Robert's contact with his family. Robert had not lost any money, but only because his daughter had intervened. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about Theo, about the way he looked at her, about the ring he was planning. I knew because he'd called to ask about Gordon's mother, Sapphire, whether it was in the safety deposit box, whether I'd mind. I didn't call him that night. I needed to think. Here's what I knew. Theo loved this woman. Theo did not know what I knew. And if I came to him with accusations he couldn't see himself, there was a real chance I would lose him. Not permanently, but in the way that matters. The way where something changes between a mother and her child and never quite goes back. I also knew I could not watch my son marry someone who had done this before. I called Bernard again. I told him everything Claude had found. He told me to keep the file somewhere secure and to document every conversation I'd had with Vivienne that had touched on finances, property, or health. Dates, what was said, what I noticed. I spent 3 evenings doing exactly that. 14 separate conversations. 14 small inquiries, each one reasonable in isolation, each one part of something when you place them side by side. It was November when Theo called to tell me he proposed. She'd said yes. He was the happiest I'd heard him since before his father died. I said, "I'm so glad, sweetheart. I love you." And then I said, "I need to see you. Just you. This week, without Vivienne." He came on a Wednesday evening. I made his father's beef stew because I knew he needed to feel at home for what I was about to say. We sat across from each other at Gordon's kitchen table, the same table where Gordon and I had argued about paint colors and laughed at bad television and held each other's hands the night the diagnosis came, and I opened Claude's file. I didn't editorialize. I didn't tell Theo what to think. I laid out what I had, the file on Vivienne's history in Calgary, the documented timeline of her questions to me, the conversation with Dr. Hendricks, the changes I'd made to my legal documents, and a printed copy of my notes from the 14 conversations. Theo was very still while he read. That Gordon quality, going quiet instead of speaking. When he finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. Finally, he said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't want to take your happiness away until I was sure," I said. "And because I needed you to be able to see it clearly, not through my worry." He asked if he could take the file home. I said yes, but I had copies. He called me 2 days later. His voice was careful in a way that told me he'd been crying and didn't want me to know. "I asked her about Calgary," he said. "What did she say?" "She said Robert's daughter was jealous and controlling and that she'd done nothing wrong." A pause. "And then I asked her why she'd asked you about the financial advisor. She said she was just trying to help." Another pause. "Mom, she didn't know I knew about all of it together. She only knew about the one question." And she still got defensive. "I know," I said. "I need some time." "Take all the time you need," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." What happened over the next 6 weeks I will only describe in broad strokes because they belong to Theo, not to me. He spoke to Vivienne. He spoke to Robert's daughter himself, directly, a phone call that confirmed everything Claude had found. He spoke to a therapist he'd been seeing on and off for years. In January, he called to tell me he'd ended the engagement. I didn't say I was relieved, though I was. I said, "How are you?" He said he was sad. He said he'd loved her. Genuinely, and that was the part that made it hard. Not the betrayal, exactly, but the grief over something that had been real for him, even if it hadn't been entirely real for her. "That's the right way to feel," I said. "I'm angry too," he said. "That's also the right way to feel." "Are you okay?" he asked. "Like, really okay? I feel like I should have been watching out for you instead of the other way around." I thought about Gordon. About what he'd said to me once when I was worrying out loud about Theo being too sensitive for the world. "He's exactly sensitive enough. Don't fix that." I said, "That's not how it works. I'm your mother. Watching out for you is my job, not the other way around. It always will be." He came for dinner that Sunday, and we didn't talk about Vivienne at all. We watched the Senators lose to the Maple Leafs, which Gordon would have found deeply unfair given that he'd been a lifelong Senators fan and felt the universe owed him better, and Theo fell asleep on the couch the way he used to at 14. And I covered him with the blanket from the back of the armchair and stood there for a moment in the quiet house. The floors creaked when I walked back to the kitchen. The window was going to stick again in July. I stood at the sink and thought about the door frame. The way she touched it that very first night, slow and deliberate, what she had been thinking in that moment, what she had seen when she looked at my house, my life, everything Gordon and I had built over 40 years of ordinary care and ordinary love. She had seen an asset. She had never seen me. That was her mistake. I am a woman who spent 31 years sitting with people in the last rooms of their lives. I have held the hands of people who wished they'd trusted themselves sooner. I have sat with people who spent years deferring to the judgment of others when their own judgment was sound. I trust myself now. I have earned it. My house still stands in Fredericton, and the crown molding still runs along the ceiling of the living room, and Gordon's mother Sapphire is back in the safety deposit box where it belongs, waiting for the right time, the right person, the right story. Theo came for dinner again last Sunday. He brought a bottle of wine, a good one, a Niagara Riesling he picked out himself, and he said, almost shyly, that he'd met someone through a friend, just once for coffee. He wasn't sure yet. "Tell me about her," I said, and he did. And I listened with everything I had, the way you listen when someone you love is beginning something new and fragile and real. I did not touch the doorframe, but I noticed when she does. People ask me sometimes, not often, but sometimes, whether I feel guilty, whether I wonder if I read the situation wrong, if I cost my son something real, if I was just a suspicious old woman who couldn't let her child be happy. I don't feel guilty, but I did sit with the question because I think you owe it to yourself to actually sit with it rather than just wave it away. Here's what I keep coming back to. Vivian made choices. A long series of them, stretching back before she ever set foot in my house, before she ever shook my hand in that restaurant on Regent Street and asked me about my years in nursing. She had done this before. She had stood in another house, in another city, and asked another man questions that sounded like small talk and meant something else entirely. She knew exactly what she was doing. That is not my guilt to carry. What I've learned, and I mean learned in the way that costs something, not the way you read in a book, is that the most dangerous thing you can do at my age is confuse politeness with safety. I was raised to be gracious, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to assume the kindest interpretation of a question. Those are not bad qualities. I'm not interested in becoming someone hard and closed, but graciousness without clarity is just vulnerability with better manners. I think about the 14 conversations I documented. Each one on its own was reasonable, explainable, forgettable. It was only when I laid them all together on Gordon's kitchen table that the shape of it became visible. That's what she was counting on, that I would process each question in isolation, that I would never step back far enough to see the pattern. She had good instincts about people. She just underestimated this particular person. What I want to say, and I mean this not as a lesson because I am not your teacher, just someone who has been through something, is that your own judgment is worth trusting, especially when it's inconvenient, especially when the thing you're noticing would complicate someone's happiness, including your own. I knew something was wrong from the night of the doorframe. I spent months finding the evidence to support what I already knew. That's not paranoia. That's just paying attention. Theo was doing better. Not fully healed. You don't love someone for 2 years and walk away without carrying something. But better. He calls more than he used to. He came by last month with groceries, which he has never done unprompted in his entire adult life, and I chose not to make a thing of it. We watched a bad movie and argued about whether the ending made sense, and somewhere in the middle of that ordinary evening I thought, this is what I protected. Not the house, not the portfolio, not the papers in Bernard's filing cabinet. This, a Tuesday night with my son, the floors creaking under our feet, Gordon's kitchen still smelling like whatever I last cooked. That is what was at stake. And I would make every one of those phone calls again. The world does not always correct itself neatly. I know that better than most. I spent 31 years watching people leave it. But I do believe that the choices we make accumulate into something. Vivian's choices accumulated into a pattern that followed her from Calgary to Halifax to Fredericton. My choices accumulated into a life that was harder to take than she'd expected. That's not fate. That's just the arithmetic of what you decide to do with your time on Earth. I am 63 years old. I have earned the right to trust myself. I intend to keep doing exactly that. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when I found my son-in-law's truck idling in my driveway at 6:30. I remember because I had just put the kettle on. The maples along the back fence had gone the color of old rust, and I was watching them through the kitchen window the way you do when you're not really looking at anything. Steam was starting to curl off the spout when I heard the crunch of gravel. My son-in-law never came by without calling first. That was just his way. Considerate, measured, the kind of man who apologized for being 2 minutes late. So when I saw him sitting behind the wheel without getting out, just sitting there with both hands on top of the steering wheel and his forehead dropped forward, I set down my mug and went outside in my housecoat. He didn't hear me come up. I had to knock on the glass twice. When he turned to look at me, I didn't recognize his face at first, not because it had changed, but because the expression on it was one I had never seen him wear. He was 34 years old, and he looked like a boy who had been told something that couldn't be untold. "Where is she?" I said. Not a question. My throat already knew. He said my daughter's name. Then he said the word hospital. And after that I stopped hearing the individual words and only heard the tone of them, which was the tone of something broken trying to hold its shape. I was in the truck with my coat half on before he finished the sentence. My daughter Renee had been with her husband for 11 years. They met at Dalhousie. She was finishing her nursing degree. He was in his second year of a mechanical engineering program, and they were the kind of couple that made you believe in something without being able to say exactly what. He worked hard. She worked harder. She worked harder. They had bought a house in Dartmouth 4 years ago, a small one on a corner lot with a leaky sunroom they kept meaning to fix, and they had been saving for a second bedroom because Renee was 4 months pregnant with their first child. I had met his mother 3 times. The first time was at the engagement dinner, which she hosted at a restaurant in Bedford she had chosen herself, and arrived at 40 minutes after the reservation. She kissed me on both cheeks the way people do when they want you to know they've been somewhere, and spent the evening asking Renee careful questions that were not quite questions, the kind that leave a mark without leaving a fingerprint. The second time was the wedding. She wore ivory. I noticed. I said nothing. The third time was the previous Christmas. My daughter had cooked for 9 hours. His mother had surveyed the table, picked up a fork, set it back down, and said to no one in particular, "It's interesting, the things people grow up eating." My daughter had smiled and passed the potatoes. That was the thing about Renee. She absorbed things. She was good at it, the way some people are good at holding pain quietly, tucking it somewhere internal where it wouldn't inconvenience anyone else. I used to think it was a strength. I understand now that I was wrong about that. She was in the third bay from the nurse's station, a curtain half pulled, an IV in her left arm and a blood pressure cuff still wrapped around her right. There was bruising along her jaw that had gone the deep purple green of a 3-day-old plum, and her left eye was swollen enough that she couldn't open it fully. I stood in the doorway for a moment because I needed a moment. Then I went in and I sat beside her and I took her hand the way I had when she was small and had nightmares, holding it between both of mine without saying anything, just holding it until her breathing slowed. "Mom," she said. Her voice was different, smaller, careful in a way that frightened me. "I'm here," I said. "You don't have to say anything yet." She said it anyway. She told me she had gone to his mother's house the evening before, alone because he was working a double shift and she hadn't wanted to worry him, because his mother had called and said she wanted to talk before the baby came. She said she wanted to settle things between them. She used that phrase specifically, settle things. Renee had thought she meant an olive branch. She had brought her mother-in-law a jar of the raspberry jam she made every August from the canes in our backyard. She didn't get to give it to her. His mother had met her at the door and taken her into the kitchen, and there was another woman there, a friend of his mother's, someone Renee had never met, and his mother had said things. She said them carefully, the same way she always did, without raising her voice, with the particular control of someone who has thought through exactly how to cause damage while remaining technically calm. She said Renee's family had no standing. She used that word, standing. She said that the child Renee was carrying would be raised correctly, meaning away from Renee's influence, meaning that she had already spoken with a lawyer about certain matters regarding the child's upbringing and my son-in-law's assets. She said that Renee had never been suitable. She said that she had told her son this from the beginning and that he would eventually understand. Then she said the thing that I cannot write without my hands going cold even now. She said that whatever happened to Renee, whatever pain she experienced, whatever losses came, she had brought them on herself by inserting herself into a family she didn't belong to. Renee had stood up to leave. The other woman blocked the doorway. His mother took hold of Renee's arm, her left arm, the one that still had bruising on it when I saw her in the hospital, and she said Renee was not going anywhere until they had finished. What happened in the next several minutes, my daughter could only describe in pieces. She got out. She got to her car. She drove 2 blocks and then pulled over because she couldn't see properly, and a man walking his dog in the dark came to the window and called 911. The doctor came in while she was still talking. He was a quiet man, efficient and kind in the way that emergency physicians learn to be. He told me that Renee and the baby were both stable, that the baby's heartbeat was strong, that they were keeping her overnight for observation. I thanked him. I waited until he left. Then I went out to the hallway and I stood beside a cart full of folded blankets and I pressed my back against the wall and I breathed. My son-in-law arrived an hour later. He had found out through me. I had called him from the parking lot of the hospital and he came in still wearing his work clothes, a smear of grease along his left forearm that he hadn't had time to wash off. He sat beside my daughter and held her hand and his face did the thing again, the thing I had seen in the driveway. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did speak, he said his mother's name, and he said it the way you say the name of something you're only now understanding. I left them alone. I went to find coffee. I sat in the waiting area under fluorescent lights that buzzed very faintly, and I thought about the jar of raspberry jam. Renee had left it on the seat of her car. She had told me this, a small detail she mentioned without understanding why she mentioned it, the way you reach for ordinary things when extraordinary things are happening. I kept thinking about it. That jar, still sitting in the cold car in the hospital parking lot, and the fact that my daughter had made it in August when she was barely showing and had spent a Saturday afternoon stirring a big pot on the stove with her hair tied up, happy in the uncomplicated way she got when she was making something. His mother would never deserve that jam. She would never deserve one single afternoon of the life my daughter had lived. I sat with that for a while. Then I took out my phone and I called my brother. My brother is 4 years older than me. He worked for 30 years as a paralegal in Halifax and has spent the last 6 in retirement doing exactly what he wants, which mostly means fishing and reading and occasionally consulting for a firm downtown when something interests him. He is not a soft man, but he is a precise one, and when something matters to him, he becomes very still and very focused in a way that I have always found reassuring. I told him everything. I did not spare any details. He listened without interrupting, which is his way, and when I finished, he was quiet for a few seconds. "Does she want to press charges?" he said. "She wants to sleep," I said. "Right now she wants to sleep. But yes, eventually, yes." "Good," he said. "Don't let her apologize to anyone. Don't let him apologize on his mother's behalf. Whatever anyone says in the next few days, Renee doesn't minimize this." "I know," I said, "and I'll make some calls in the morning," he said. I knew what that meant. I said thank you. I meant it the way you mean it when someone picks up a weight you've been holding alone. His mother called my daughter's cell phone the following morning. I was there when the screen lit up. We were still at the hospital. Renee sitting up in the bed with better color in her face, her husband asleep in the chair in the corner, and we both looked at the phone for a moment without touching it. "Don't," I said. Renee looked at me. "Let it ring," I said. "Whatever she's calling to say, it is not an apology. People like her don't call the morning after to apologize." Renee let it ring. Afterward, she told me she felt something release in her chest when she did. A small release, like a valve. She said she had spent 11 years picking up every call, answering every text, adjusting herself to his mother's hours and moods and preferences, and letting the phone ring was the first time in 11 years she hadn't done that. She said it felt strange, and then it felt right, and then she cried a little, quietly, looking out the window at the October sky. I held her hand again. I am good at that, at least. There are things that happen in the weeks after something like this that nobody tells you about. The paperwork, for one. The statements to give and the forms to fill and the calls to return. Renee gave a statement to the police the day after she was released from hospital. She was calm and precise. She had her nursing brain in. I could see it, the part of her that goes clinical when clinical is what's needed. And she told them everything without embellishment. The officer was a young woman who wrote quickly and asked good questions and did not once suggest that Renee might be misremembering. His mother gave a different account. She said Renee had been agitated, that she'd become irrational, that she had tripped. She said this with the friend present as a witness, which is why she had brought the friend. I understand that now. She had planned for Renee to come. She had known my daughter would come as she called and use the right words, and she had arranged a witness before my daughter walked through the door. My brother had anticipated this. When I told him about the friend, he said simply, "Good. That's two of them then. A witness to what was said is still a witness to what was said." He had found a lawyer, a woman named Barb Hennigar who worked out of a small office on Barrington Street and had, according to my brother, spent 20 years being underestimated and had made a reliable practice out of it. She met with Renee twice, and she was direct in the way I appreciate in people. She said what the case was, what it wasn't, and what it would require. What it would require mainly was time and patience, and Renee not making it easier for anyone by being gracious. "You don't owe her grace," Barb Hennigar told my daughter in that second meeting, in the flat, certain tone of someone stating a fact. "You owe her nothing." I could have kissed that woman. My son-in-law moved out of his mother's life with a quiet efficiency that I think surprised even him. He had grown up understanding her to be a fixed point. Difficult, yes. Demanding, yes. But fixed, and discovering that she was capable of what she had done reoriented him in some fundamental way. He told me this himself, one evening in November when he came by to drop off some groceries and stayed for tea. He sat at my kitchen table and looked at his hands for a while, and then said that he kept replaying things from the past 11 years, small moments, things his mother had said or arranged or suggested that he had passed off as her personality. "She was always moving things," he said. "I thought it was just how she was." "It was how she was," I said. "That's the point." He nodded slowly. He drank his tea. He was not a man who found words easily, but he was a man who, once he understood something, held it without letting go. I respected that about him. I had always respected that about him, even in the years when I was watching my daughter quietly adjust herself to make everyone comfortable, because I had understood that he saw her, really saw her, even if he hadn't always understood what he was seeing. He loved her. That was the part his mother had never been able to account for. The charges were laid in January. Assault causing bodily harm, criminal harassment, and one additional charge related to the incident that I will not name here because Renee has asked me not to put it in words outside of the legal proceedings, and I will respect that. There was a publication ban for a period of time that my brother navigated with more patience than I could have managed. His mother hired a lawyer of her own. Of course she did. He was expensive, and she had money, and she spent the months before the trial making various approaches through various people, relatives, mutual acquaintances, her priest. At one point, a letter from a cousin Renee had never met, all of which Barb Hennigar handled with the same flat, certain tone she used for everything. "Forward them to me," she said each time. "Don't respond." Renee didn't respond. What she did instead in those months was rest and work when she could, and let her husband paint the second bedroom the pale yellow-green she had picked from a color swatch in March. She let her body do what bodies do when given room and safety and time. She let the baby grow. My granddaughter was born on a Wednesday in April, during a wet spring that came in off the Atlantic all at once and turned everything suddenly and improbably green. She was 8 pounds and 2 ounces, and she had her father's chin and her mother's hands, the long fingers, and she screamed with great conviction from the first minute, which I found encouraging. They named her after nobody. They picked a name that was just hers, one we hadn't heard before, one that didn't carry anyone else's weight. I thought that was wise. I sat in the recovery room and held her while Renee slept, and I looked at her small face for a long time. She had the blurry, unfinished look of the very new, the look of something that hasn't decided yet what it will become. And I thought about the fact that this child would grow up knowing that her mother had not broken, that her mother had been hurt and had been frightened and had been threatened in ways she shouldn't have had to endure, and had held herself together anyway, and had kept going, and had pressed charges, and had not apologized, and had not gone quiet. I thought about all the things Renee had absorbed over 11 years, and I thought about how she had finally stopped absorbing. There's a kind of grief in that, too, for the years before, for all the dinners where she smiled and passed the potatoes, for all the phone calls she picked up that she should have let ring. But the grief sits alongside something else now, something more durable. The case was heard in late September. I will not give you the details of the proceedings because they are not mine to give, and because this is not a story about a courtroom. It's a story about a kitchen in October, and a jar of jam on a car seat, and a young woman who went to offer peace and was met with the opposite. What I will tell you is the outcome. His mother was convicted on 2 of the 3 charges. She was given a conditional sentence and 3 years of probation, and she is required to have no contact with my daughter, my son-in-law, or my granddaughter for the duration of that probation and beyond, if my daughter chooses to extend it. Barb Hennigar had pushed for that last condition with particular focus, and she got it. His mother's friend, the witness she had arranged, was not charged, but she was named in the proceedings, and she gave testimony that, in the end, corroborated more of Renee's account than it did his mother's. I don't know whether that was conscience or self-preservation. My brother said it didn't matter. He said outcomes are outcomes. It is March now. The baby is almost a year old and has learned to pull herself up against the coffee table and look around with the expression of someone who has just summoned something significant. The sunroom finally got fixed last fall. My son-in-law did it himself over 3 weekends, and my brother came down from Halifax to help him, and they worked in companionable silence the way men of that type do. I went over on a Saturday in February, and we all ate dinner together, the 6 of us including my brother, around the table they pushed into the kitchen because the dining room still has boxes in it. The baby sat in her high chair and destroyed a piece of soft bread with enormous focus. Renee made soup from the last of the autumn squash she'd kept in the cold room, a thick, sweet soup that steamed the windows. At one point, my brother looked across the table at my daughter and said, "You did good, kid." Renee said, "We did." He shook his head slightly. "You did." She let him have that. She smiled into her soup. I looked at my granddaughter, who had moved on from the bread and was examining her own fist with the gravity of a philosopher, and I thought about what it means to come from people who don't fold. I come from those people. My daughter comes from those people, and now, without having any say in it yet, so does that little girl in the high chair, mashing bread and discovering her hands, whole and ordinary and completely unaware of the year it took to give her this table, this soup, this plain and precious evening. She'll know it someday. I'll make sure of it, not to burden her. But because she deserves to know where she comes from, because the women who came before her held the line and kept going, and that's not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. I've thought a lot, in the months since all of this, about what it actually takes to stop. Not to fight back. That part, oddly, is easier than people think, once the shock settles and the anger finds its shape. What's harder is the stopping. The moment when you decide you will no longer absorb what is being handed to you. The moment when you let the phone ring. Renee spent 11 years being accommodating. She was good at it. Genuinely good. Not performatively. And I think for a long time she mistook that goodness for virtue. I did too, if I'm honest. I watched her smile at dinners and deflect unkind comments and adjust herself around a woman who had decided before they'd ever really met that my daughter wasn't enough. And I told myself it was grace, maturity, the compromise that long relationships require. But there's a difference between grace and erasure, and it took a hospital bed in October for both of us to understand that fully. What I keep coming back to is this: the choices we make over time have a way of compounding. His mother had spent years making small choices, a cutting comment here, a calculated slight there, a friend arranged in a doorway, and each one she got away with made the next one feel possible. That's not fate. That's not some invisible hand keeping score. It's just the plain, unglamorous truth that behavior that goes unchallenged tends to escalate. She had never been stopped. Not really. Not until Renee stopped absorbing and started telling the truth about what had happened, clearly and without softening it for anyone's comfort. And Renee, my Renee, who made jam on Saturdays and worked night shifts and smiled when she should have said something, her years of quiet also compounded. Into exhaustion, yes. Into a kind of self-erasure that frightened me when I finally saw it clearly, but also into a reserve of patience and precision that served her well when it mattered. She gave that statement to the police with a stillness that I don't think she could have managed if she hadn't already lived through 11 years of learning to hold herself together. I'm not saying the suffering was worth it. It wasn't. I'm saying she used it, which is a different thing entirely, and she used it without bitterness, which is harder still. My brother used to say, and he got this from our father, who was not a sentimental man but was an observant one, that integrity isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you do when the outcome is uncertain and the easier path is right there in front of you. Renee could have settled. She could have accepted an apology that was never offered, smoothed things over, kept the peace the way she always had. Nobody would have blamed her. Some people, frankly, would have encouraged it. She didn't. She held the line at considerable cost to herself, and she did it not out of anger, but out of something quieter and more durable, a decision that she was worth telling the truth for. I think about my granddaughter pulling herself up against the coffee table with that look of absolute concentration, and I think she is going to be fine, not because life will be easy, it won't, but because she is coming from people who know the difference between keeping the peace and losing themselves. That's not a small thing to inherit. It's, in fact, just about everything.